Hello. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for coming here, joining me in our side event hosted by the UN Habitat. The title of the side event is Planning for Climate Mobility, Pioneering Spatial Strategies for Resilient Urban Future Across Regions. Joining me here today, Mr. Manuel Marquez, starting from the left, Ms. Sarah Rosengartner, Dr. Hussein Bayraktar, and Caroline Shirop, then lastly, my colleague Jia Kongang. I would like to give the floor for Mr. Manuel Pereira to give the opening remarks for our side event.
Thank you, and good morning to you all, to the audience and our colleague panelists. I will try to be very brief. My job today was to put a bit of perspective from the point of view of the International Organization for Migrations on the issues of climate mobility in cities. Climate mobility sits very close to climate justice, because enabling the right to stay or the right to move is bringing back to individuals the choices about their lives and their future. Any form of mobility or immobility will need a very conscious climate development and spatial development. Thus, spatial planning is a key factor on these approaches. We could look at the importance of planning for the protection of infrastructures, landscapes, and communities. The land tenure and the planning uses of embankments in Bangladesh that were occupied over several years as areas of new development and informal settings have clearly impacted the capacity to distribute floodwaters during 2022 floods. At the same time, many cities around the world are growing informally without being able to cope with the impacts of climate change. The city of Beira in Mozambique was built below sea level, and the cyclones of the recent years have shown how the lack of spatial planning has created tragedy. At the same time, islands in the Pacific faced a tough decision of relocation. It's important to bring spatial planning on any other development for these communities or the safeguard of the safe communities. More interestingly, in many urban areas of the world, the capacity of cities to be more permeable and to have more reforestation is growing. Examples of cities like Rotterdam are bringing to the table the importance of sponge cities where water is preserved and not passing through. We believe that the current situation of climate and the impacts on many communities will further bring the importance of urbanization and the drive for new livelihoods into these cities. How these cities grow, how these cities transform will be critical for safety, for future, and to make migration positive for all. We should build back better. We should build back safer. Disasters are not natural. They are social economical phenomena, and spatial planning can help us reduce disasters and contribute to avert, minimize, and address the adverse impacts of climate change in many communities on the move, willing to move, but above all, wanting to stay. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Now I'm introducing Ms. Sarah Rosengartner. She is the Deputy Manager, Managing Director for the Global Center for Climate Mobility, GCCM, and she oversees the GCCM's regional initiatives in Africa and Greater Caribbean, as well as its knowledge hub with the Columbia University Climate School.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to be with you. I will share some findings from our work in Africa. Thank you for putting up the slides. But maybe as an opening introduction to some of the work that I'm about to present, our work started about 2 years ago as a joint effort of the African Union Commission, several UN agencies, including IOM, the World Bank, supported by GCCM, to look at how are climate mobility dynamics affecting the African continent. What are the decisions that people are making today in the context of climate impacts? And what are possible future scenarios for how many people might be moving? Where will they leave? Where will they go? So some of the work that I'm presenting is stemming from this collective effort. The modeling was done by Columbia University. The field research was done by the Mixed Migration Center. And we have honed in on cities as one critical constituency in the mobilization of different stakeholders around this knowledge. So we did modeling, we did field research, but we also had a whole stakeholder engagement process throughout 2022. And cities and mayors were one critical constituency that we sought to mobilize and to hear from them in terms of what is their ability to A, use this kind of data, but also B, then to act on it and do something with it. And we are now in a second phase of the initiative where we're actually working with individual mayors and cities to see, can we use some of this data to start at the city level, analyzing the dynamics around climate and migration and how cities can better plan and respond. But as you will see, and I'll ask colleagues to put up the first slide, the dynamics across cities are really far from uniform. So we conducted research in 3 cities and 3 cities, 4 rural locations across the continent. And first of all, I think one general finding is that most people do not want to leave where they are. They want to stay in their communities. For those who are moving, most of them actually do not move very far. So it's very rare for people to move to the big capital cities unless they're already close by. Most of the movement is to smaller secondary cities. And in the big cities where we did research, we found also very different dynamics. So this is in Alexandria, Egypt, where research was done in a community that was close to the water, fishing community in Al-Maks. And there we had a very high response rate of people saying, we're not considering moving. There are very few people who were going from this community for international migration, but most of the community was saying, we're not going anywhere. We later found that this was in a context where there are relocations happening of communities, not necessarily always voluntary. And so there's also a question around how to interpret some of these responses from people. But it was really an outlier that in Al-Maks, the community was very much saying climate impacts we don't really see, and we also do not consider moving. The next city we looked at was Lagos, as informal settlement, again, like really close to the water, called Ajegunle. And there we had a much higher rate of people who had already moved into this area and who were wanting to move out of this area, mostly for economic reasons, mostly to get to a better part of the city, get to better economic opportunities. But they also said, yeah, we get regularly flooding here. We experience flooding. But they did look at that as more of a nuisance than actually kind of a cost to be moving out of that neighborhood. And then the third city we looked at was Beira, Mozambique. And this was, as was just mentioned by my colleague, obviously they have had very severe impacts and people have already been displaced in large numbers. But we also found that many of them came back actually. So they had been resettled, had been offered to relocate by the government, but many came back because their livelihoods and also like their kids' access to school and things like that was tied to the city. But many of them said, we would really like to move, but we don't really see many options for us to move to a new place where we can continue living our way of life. Then to the modeling findings, I know I'm running out of time, so I'll go quick, but we found surprisingly that overall in the continent, the movement of people due to climate impact is projected to increase by up to over 100 million people at the highest end. It's like 113 million people that could be on the move, and this is within countries, only internal mobility. Yet when we looked at the data only for cities, there was actually a slight decrease. It's not that large in the overall context of the African population, but cities were actually projected to see a decline in population by about up to 4 million people by 2050. So it's a small decrease, but it's interesting. Next slide. This is the distribution, and this is cities that will be growing, but where climate impacts will actually kind of dent that growth, slow that growth down. The way we interpret that is to say these are cities that will likely be negatively impacted by climate, causing some people to leave, but yes, yet you still have growing numbers of people in those cities. So those are cities you should be kind of concerned about. Next slide are the cities that are projected to either have growing populations driven by climate impacts. If you go one slide further. Yeah, and you see that that's very clustered in northern part and eastern part of the continent. So this is urban population growth driven by climate factors. And that's very heavily concentrated in the IGAD region. And then next slide. This is calculations we've done on a city by city basis. And I mentioned now we want to go down to the city level to help city administrations understand what could be the dynamics. Obviously, these projections come with margins of errors, with uncertainty, but to understand, like, you know, is my city projected to see people move out because of climate impacts? Is it projected to grow in population because of climate impacts? And where are the risks and the population, the demographic growth concentrated? So I'll stop here, and I look forward to the other intervention.
Thank you, Sarah, for your intervention. Allow me here to let Mr. Dr. Hussein Bayraktar to intervene in our session. Dr. Hussein serves as the Director General of the European Union and Foreign Affairs at the Ministry of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change of the Republic of Turkey. He has a history of academic appointments at the several universities, currently teaching graduate doctorate students on the geographic GIS information systems at the Technical University through distance education. Dr. Hussein, as the Director of General European Union, what would be the main migration challenges faced by the people in Turkey?
Thank you. Can I use that one?
I think it's working, yeah.
I couldn't open my
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Rüveyde. Nice. It's very nice to be here, and thanks for the invitation. Today, we gather to address a defining global phenomenon that shapes the future of our societies, urbanization. More than half of the world's population now resides in urban areas, a number expected to climb to 2/3 by the year 2050. Yet, the shift is not without its challenges. Escalating crises, be natural or man-made, have driven a significant influx of migrants to cities, bringing with them a diverse range of backgrounds and needs. In our beloved Turkey, the impacts of this rapid urbanization are acutely felt. We witness the arrival of refugees seeking shelter and hope within our cities. These challenges have profound spatial, economic, and social consequences, exacerbating the existing challenges faced by municipalities. It's evident that cities are struggling to provide immediate relief, let alone long-term solutions. Our response to this complex scenario must be guided by sustainable, long-term urban development visions. Urban planning emerges a linchpin in its pursuits by integrating the principles of development and humanitarian assistance. Urban planning can offer effective solutions, creating opportunities and improving access to services for both local and migrant communities. Yet the challenge goes beyond more development. It encompasses urban resilience in the face of migration and climate change. Participatory approaches in urban planning become indispensable tools in addressing these intertwined challenges. Involving migrants and the most vulnerable populations in the planning process enhances a city's adaptability to climate change, mitigates risks faced by migrants, and fosters the creation of more inclusive and resilient urban environments. The essence of today's event lies in the recognition of multiple voices and the diverse roles played by key actors in developing process. Government decision makers, civil society, migrant communities, financiers, donors, technical experts, and the private sector all have vital roles in creating an inclusive dialogue. It is through this collaborative effort that we can chart a course towards sustainable solutions. Our discussions today will delve into urban resilience with a migration context, shedding light on experiences in tackling urban challenges linked to the climate change. The spotlight will be on this program, serving as a compelling case study. This program aims to effect transformative interventions in the most vulnerable urban areas through integrated and participatory spatial planning. Crucially, it connects these interventions to broader goal of combining climate change, emphasizing the interconnectedness of these critical issues. As we navigate these uncharted waters of urbanization, migration, and climate change, let us remember that the strength of our response lies in unity. It lies in understanding the multifaceted nature of challenges we face and the collective responsibility we share. Through inclusive dialogue and innovative solutions, we can pave the way of resilient, sustainable urban development that serves the needs of all, fostering a future where cities are not just habitats, but symbols of hope and harmony. In addressing these formidable challenges posed by the migrant crisis, Turkey has demonstrated remarkable resilience and proactive governance through the concerted efforts of Ministry of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change. Our minister, recognizing the urgency of the situation, has played a pivotal role in coordinating and implementing effective strategies to assist municipalities in coping with the influx of migrants. Through a comprehensive approach that encompasses urban planning, environmental considerations, and climate change mitigation, the ministry has taken significant strides towards creating sustainable solutions. One key aspect of Turkey's success under the leadership of His Excellency President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and our Minister, Mr. Mehmet Özaseki, both of who are known for their excellent work as mayors of 2 metropolitan municipalities of Turkey in managing the migrant crisis, lies in its strategic partnerships with international financial institutions, notably the World Bank and the Islamic Development Bank. Through collaborative initiatives, Turkey has accessed critical financial resources that have been channeled into national and international projects aimed to addressing the multifaceted challenges faced by municipalities. These projects are not only provide immediate relief, but also contribute to long-term urban development goals, aligning with the vision of creating resilient and inclusive urban spaces. The ministries adopt utilization of international cooperation and comprehensively leveraging global resources for local solutions. We express our sincere appreciation to all stakeholders involved, including our Minister of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change, for their proactive role in managing the migrant crisis in Turkey. The dedication of effective collaboration exhibited by various entities, both national and international, have been instrumental in navigating the complexities of this challenge. Together, we are forging resilient resolutions and shaping a future where urban development is not just a response, but a testament to our collective strength and commitment. Thank you to all partners for contributing to success of these endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. Can you tell us can you name one vulnerable neighborhood in Turkey?
Neighborhood, which
Yeah, which is most affected by refugees?
Kilis, Gaziantep, the borders of Syria.
Yeah.
And all are very affected, and including Istanbul, the biggest city of Turkey, is very affected. Almost 4 million people in Turkey is migrant now, especially from Syria, Iraq, and those.
And that area was heavily affected by the recent earthquake.
Yes.
It doesn't have to do with climate, but it's also a natural hazard that
Yes,
happened in
yes.
that area.
Yes, unfortunately, you know, this earthquake, two very severe earthquakes, and it happened like several hours after each other. It's really affected 18 cities of Turkey.
Oh.
And more than 50 million people. And we unfortunately, more than 50,000 people were dead in this earthquake.
Does the government have any procedures or strategies to deal with displacement of these neighborhoods to other locations?
You know, we are an earthquake country, we say it, like that. And there are nowhere out of the risk of the earthquake. And we are now facing a very difficult problem, and we are trying to solve it. And we are looking a very strong soils to build the houses, and maybe new types of the buildings like steel houses or something like that for the earthquake.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein.
Thank you
Now
so
we
much.
move on to the African continent with my colleague Carolyn Shiro. She is the legislative procurement officer at the Parliament of Kenya. She's an advocate for climate resilience, focusing on Africa's vulnerable communities, this liaison for the Parliamentary Climate Consensus, promoting sustainable practices, recent alumni of the African Group, of negotiators, expert support climate governance program. She is dedicated in advancing climate policy and governance. Welcome, Caroline. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Roida. I will focus on the policy brief that colleagues and I were able to produce during my time at the Climate Academy. This was an academy, the 16th Academy, organized by the United Nations University of School on Environment and Human Security. And so we actually, this was a product of about 23 practitioners and persons who have been able to deal or work on planned relocation and human mobility as a result of climate change for quite some time. So basically what I'm going to do today is focus on the East Africa and Kenya concept, particularly what it means for us in Africa, what it means for us in East Africa, what it means in Kenya. And to quickly just give you a highlight that East Africa encompassing countries like Ethiopia, Somalia, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, faces a unique environmental challenge, and it's largely driven by its geographical setup, because our countries are very much placed on the eastern coast of the Indian Ocean, but you'll find we have varied climates across these countries. For example, in my own country, this is the Kenya, we have varied climates. We have the coastal region, we have the deserts, we have the tropics. So climate when the elements of climate happen, they actually affect us in a great way. So what has happened is that across East Africa, the intersection of environmental degradation, climate change, and social economic factors creates complex mobility dynamics. These challenges require multifaceted approaches, including sustainable land management, climate resilient initiatives, and policies that address the needs of displaced and migrating populations. I remember my colleagues Sarah and Doc speaking about this issue of human mobility, of having to integrate issues of planned relocation in our day-to-day work, and coming from a place where I'm actually working with policymakers, parliamentarians to be specific. It has become very urgent to actually consider planned relocation, human mobility in our policy. And this is because during the academy we did a survey of the countries that have integrated human mobility or planned relocation in their policies. And let me tell you, just about 2 in the East Coast, Fiji, and I think Indonesia or something like that, are the only countries that have a policy on how to deal with planned relocation. And planned relocation is not just as a result of it is not just specific to climate disasters. Planned relocation we looked for those countries that have planned relocation as a result of climate disasters, and most of them did not have, because most of the countries were looking at it like it is a new concept. And so we as policymakers or those practitioners needed to bring this conversation to their fore. That is why the policy is right here. I think I will ask I wanted you to look at the case studies from key concept 1 all the way to the last one. And one of the things that we actually agreed is that a people-centered planned relocation is very important, because involving affected communities in the decision-making and building on local knowledge systems is very key, because most planned relocation fail. Moving people or migrating people from their areas fails most of the time because the host communities, the people who are being moved, do not understand why they need to move from their home areas. And so if you involve them in that decision and also involve the host communities in that decision, it becomes easier. Secondly, there is need for a clear, maybe on the second one, this is key insight 1, on the second key insight, The need for clear national frameworks or guidelines designed with community inputs to safeguard individual and community rights has also become very key. And that is one of the issues that we raised. And also, we also discussed that they need to emphasize for proactive planning, long-term commitment, and sustainable financing is very important. That was found in key insight number 3, because we realize that planned relocation is a long-term issue. It needs time. And I'll give the example of the cyclone Idai in Mozambique, whereby 4 years after cyclone Idai hit that country, people are still being moved. Permanent structures are being constructed. So there's need for commitment. It needs us to continue working on it, engaging communities, engaging policymakers, engaging governments, engaging the international community, because sustainable solutions take a while. Also, we needed to address the diverse perceptions of loss. And you will realize that in as much as we are trying to, in as much as the governments will say this was a successful planned relocation of the people that were affected, in terms of no deaths were recorded, property was lost, but at least human life was saved, you'll realize that there's essentially a loss, not in terms of economy, but probably, but in terms of the people, the culture where they used to stay, the sort of the ecosystem they had, they lose that. That we termed as a non-economic loss. Eventually, there'll still be a loss. And also addressing this economic and non-economic loss associated with relocation needs time as well. It needs to be participatory, yes. And so why are we discussing planned relocation? It's because we are at a COP, and most of these matters of planned relocation are not in countries' national adaptation plans, or they are national designated, nationally determined contributions. So why we are here is because this is the conversation that we need to have in our national adaptation plans and also our NDCs. Therefore, this is why this policy brief is coming right now, that collaboration with affected people and this continued conversation with governments is important. So a key takeaway and proposed roadmap for the future is that we should see planned relocation not as a threat, but as an instrument to avoid involuntary displacement, because this concept is here with us. It is no longer a future concept. In my country, the last 3 weeks, we have been experiencing the worst kind of flooding that our country has never felt. This is worse than the El Nino of 1998. And so this conversation is becoming to the fore of our government. What do? We need to have this conversation. And so this can be a participatory solution to addressing loss and damage. And so it's a complex process. It requires multi-stakeholders. It requires people. It needs to be looked at many angles and integrate different stakeholder groups. But at the end of the day, it's here with us. We need to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn, for your intervention. Joining me now, my colleague from the UN Habitat, Gia Kongang. Gia is a Human Settlement Officers at the Urban Practices Branch, Global Solutions Division at the UN Habitat. She oversees the UN Habitat's umbrella program on planning for humanitarian development practices, which aims to utilize urban planning solutions to respond to humanitarian crisis, urban migration and displacement. Her work has focused on enabling participation and improving partnership through the designing programs and policies for most vulnerable communities through the lens of humanitarian development, peace, and climate response. Gia holds a Master in Architecture and Urban Design from the National University of Singapore.
Thank you very much, Ruwaida, and thank you everyone for joining us today in the side event. As you have heard from my colleagues on the panel, climate change and its impacts on displacement and mobility are increasingly global concerns that impact cities, concerns that impact everyone. There is a greater need to address climate in consideration to the humanitarian development and peace responses, as mentioned from my colleagues earlier as well, as several of these settlements and several of these populations that live within these settlements are often located already in fragile and often hostile environments and systems. Next slide, please. And I'd like to introduce very briefly the umbrella program at UN Habitat, Planning for Humanitarian Development Practice, Connecting Normative to Operations. The program itself aims to utilize urban planning to manage existing and new settlements through good governance, through ensuring the strengthening of the integration of migrating and hosting communities, to support an environment ripe for sustainable development and local economic growth, to enhance capacity and ownership, and to disseminate the best practices and lessons learned that we have gathered internationally and across multiple different contexts. Today, I would like to showcase three different projects, projects that actually touch in different contexts and that actually are across three different scales. Next slide, please. And the next one, thank you. The first project that I would like to share is at the territorial level, the Sahel Spatial Development Strategy, coordinated by UN Habitat, UNDP, and Sweden. We see clearly in the Sahel that the patterns of human settlements have been shaped by several different factors. These include historically agriculture, trade, access to resources, conflict, as well as climate change. The uncertainty that is felt by the populations in the Sahel have been the push very often in the mobility and the migration of its people. At the same time, we see a large population movement due to insecurity and displacement crises in the region, which has led to rapid urbanization. More and more people are choosing to migrate and to reside in cities and urban areas. There is a greater need to strengthen the network of settlements hosting these populations, as well as to build urban-rural linkages. Next slide, please. Using a territorial approach, a spatial planning methodology has been developed to support the planning and the prioritization process of these response. For example, you'll see, as mentioned earlier, that the patterns of agriculture, in response to conflict, for greater resource access, and climate change have resulted in these population movements. And through a spatial planning method that encompasses and encourages prioritization of specific considerations and factors, we are able to suggest the priorities that need to be most urgently addressed within these territories. The second example that I would like to share is the Urban Planning and Infrastructure in Migration Context project. This is supported by the government of Switzerland. The project itself is implemented across 3 different countries that are facing urban migration phenomenon. This is Jordan, Egypt, and Cameroon. The project itself has 4 parts. It aims first to use spatial analytics through the data collection and analytical process, followed by the second part looking at visioning and scenario building, working for a fully participatory design process to prioritize specific infrastructure investments, answering to these needs, and then to link to potential financiers that can actually support the development and the implementation of these infrastructures. Lessons that we have learned can then also be shared through adequate knowledge management. These solutions proposed are in specific urban areas within these countries, and the project looks across a national, moving towards a neighborhood level, where you see the most vulnerable communities living amongst the host communities, be it refugees or IDPs. Next slide, please. I would like to share specifically the case of Cameroon, where the project looked at Douala, the city which hosts the most IDPs in the littoral region. Despite this situation, it has continued to receive a population influx due to continued unrest and conflict. Next slide, please. Within Douala 4, where the focus on I would like to share there are specific climate change phenomenon that have resulted in specific vulnerabilities being escalated in the area as well. These include flooding events, as well as the sea level rise concerns due to its coastal nature. Next slide. The project has been able to identify through the first two stages the reasons and the existing challenges of which plague the host community as well as the IDP population. These include the destruction and the loss of mangroves over many generations. These include the lack of adequate infrastructure, for example, inadequate drainage, the blockage of drainage. This as well includes the lack of adequate green public spaces, nature's buffers that can actually support to protect the populations here. Through the prioritization process, next slide. Through the prioritization process, the project proposes for dikes and riverbank development, the conservation and the restoration of mangroves, the design for parks and retention ponds, extension of drainage and infrastructure networks, as well as digital solutions for climate action. So you can see moving into the city level, moving into the neighborhood level, there are many different opportunities and ways in which urban planning, spatial planning can actually help to suggest solutions in response to climate change. The last project that I would like to share is a piece of normative work which has been developed in response to the arid and semi-arid lands in East Africa, which my colleague Caroline had spoken about briefly as well earlier. These areas are commonly impacted by migration and displacement, largely due to the environment as well as to climate change impacts that are being faced. The piece of work is, to the next slide. The piece of work is the designing for displacement in drylands, spatial planning along intermittent rivers. Next slide, please. We have seen in the region in general on the continent that dryland expansion is escalating. This is due to several reasons, land degradation, and of course, extreme weather events, which Caroline had alluded to before. We expect that by 2050, 86 million migrants would have been forced to be displaced or forced to move due to climatic reasons. Next slide, please. This surge is further seen in East Africa, through what Caroline has already shared, and I myself might emphasize, the 4 or 5 times failed rainy seasons, for example, experienced in Kenya, as well as now the super El Nino facing the population. The issue of water scarcity and drought in the region is paramount. Next slide, please. And what the piece of study and this design work that we're doing is to propose spatial solutions, integrated spatial designs that are resilient and which strengthen integration of populations. We want to make sure that there are 3 criteria to these solutions as they are being proposed. Number 1, that they are nature-based, that they are able to address these water needs in these ASAL regions. Number 2, that this presents economic development and livelihood opportunities for the populations who are facing this strife. Number 3, that they are comprehensive and fully inclusive. And I'd like to showcase very briefly some examples of the designs and our illustrations to back this up on the next slide. Please, thank you. For example, and now we're moving definitely into the neighborhood and to the very human scale of the discussion. For example, a floodable amphitheater design. In the dry season, a stage used as a public space. In the wet season, intentionally flooded and used for water collection and storage. The next slide, please. Sand dam orchards and public space. In the dry season, the residual moisture can be used for riverbank farming, the nutritious soil harvested for farming, which can continue to protect the dam. In the wet season, flood waters captured and soil fertility promoted, the surrounding area being used for the cultivation of crops. Next slide, please. Water spreading bunds with kitchen gardens. In the dry season, the gardens use residual moisture to grow drought-tolerant crops. The other gardens are used for public functions. In the wet season, the bunds located between the homesteads and the rivers are managed for gardening and other uses. And to the last slide. This piece of work we aim to publish in the next couple of weeks, hopefully before COP, Please do scan the QR code. Please reach out to me personally if you'd like to be kept updated on this piece of work. At the same time, I would like to share as well that we're looking for partners and organizations and colleagues who would like to expand this piece of work to other regions as well. So we're very happy to talk about it. And just to round up the presentation, looking at the territorial scale, moving then to the city scale and then to the urban design scale. Urban planning can play and present so many opportunities and solutions that we can tap into work and into convincing the people who need to hear this as well, to find solutions for populations affected by the climate change and who are moving because of it as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gia, for showcasing us some of your work by UN Habitat. I'd like to just take the opportunity to welcome some of the audience here we have at the side event. We have the Deputy Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Ms. Fatima Varnak. She is the Chief Negotiator for Climate Change. Welcome. And also in the front row, we have the Ambassador Fariba Hokashi, Deputy Director General for Environment and Energy and Transport, Water of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Turkey. Welcome. And next speaker, we have Shada Al-Sharif. Ms. Shada, she is an unrecognized advocate for climate change, green economic transition and sustainable development in Jordan and the MENA region. She has held leadership position and senior advisory roles in public, private, and international organizations. She is considered a thorough leader in green economic investment and finance, climate change policy, clean technology, writing, speaking, and in water, energy, food, environment nexus. Thank you, Shada.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And since we're talking about mobility today, I can report that there was very little mobility as I was arriving into Expo today due to the crowd. So I apologize for being late to my panelists. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, UN Habitat, thank you for inviting me to share a perspective from the Middle East and North Africa region on this issue. I hope the sound is clear. Yeah. So I just wanted to say, before we delve into climate mobility, it's important to remember that forced displacements in our region due to conflicts and climate mobility are intertwined, as well as internal displacements due to a range of factors, some climate-induced, but others socioeconomic, where we continue to see rural-urban migration to address issues like poverty and unemployment. I also want to, it's important, I think, to acknowledge that almost 1.5 million people have been internally displaced in Gaza over the past month, whose access to water, energy, and food has been cut off overnight, ecosystems destructed, including long-term damage to the soil and fertile lands, rendering them unfit for agriculture with years to recuperate, and infrastructure destroyed, including wastewater treatment plants, resulting in untreated wastewater being discharged into the Mediterranean. Many of these are pre-existing vulnerabilities, which will only be amplified under climate change. And so it just seems like a climate disaster unfolding in real time in front of our eyes at a catastrophic scale. And here at COP, we hear many call for human rights, peace, resource security before climate rights. And so I think it's important not to lose sight of this truth, particularly in the context of the MENA region and as a crisis really unfolds as we speak. To the topic at hand, I'd like to share with you some recent findings from the IOM on climate and mobility in MENA. Of course, countries of the MENA region, and I say MENA, Middle East and North Africa, are vulnerable to extremely high temperatures, limited groundwater and rainfall, and scarce agricultural and arable land. The region, of course, is described as one of the most water-stressed in the world. The IPCC has called it a climate change hotspot. And while the world tries to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, countries in the region, some of them have already reached this threshold. And of course, the drying and temperature increase is happening at a faster rate in the MENA region, increasing the risks of heat waves. So in this context, there's an important field of study emerging, that of the climate fragility nexus or climate displacement nexus, as many countries are already fragile and conflict afflicted. And we see that there's a move towards further research on the link between climate and peace building. Climate can undermine human security, and which has implications for peace building, but the opposite also seems true, where conflicts can be exacerbated by climate. So within the region, the main climate hazards are risks to food security and malnutrition. We're talking about micronutrient deficiencies, loss of livelihoods due to this reduction in food production, increased risks, as I said, to water and energy securities due to the drought and heat, and reduced economic output. That continues to be a big challenge for countries of the region, including Jordan. But the main climate impacts that we are seeing unfolding are increasing impacts on displacement, flood and storm-induced damages in the coastal areas like Egypt, damage to infrastructure, as we have seen in Amman over the past few rainstorms, and then damage to key economic sectors, particularly agriculture. And so according to the IOM, there have been around 233,000 disaster displacements linked to climate in the MENA region, and mostly due to floods. The number due to flooding is the majority of that number. It's about 178,000 people. The projection is that by 2050, 19 million people would be internal climate migrants in the region. In Iraq, we have data that about 5,700 families or 34,000 people are displaced today due to drought across 10 governorates in the center and south of Iraq. In Sudan, droughts, floods, and conflict contribute to the deteriorating socioeconomic situation and decreased resilience. And so the IOM, for example, is working with the government to manage storage facilities and emergency relief supplies. What we lack, it seems, is systemic monitoring of displacement due to climate. And so the project that our colleagues talked about that's being undertaken by UN Habitat is so important to generate that monitoring and that data. And IOM is supporting countries in the region really to link climate and environmental degradation to displacement. And what we've seen is that there's some work happening right now in Iraq and others such as Bahrain, UAE, and KSA to conduct these kinds of studies. Another interesting report coming up that I think we'd all want to look at the outcomes of is the Regional Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction, which is issued by the UNDRR. I just wanted to thank my colleague previously who mentioned the UPIMC project, and she touched on Jordan and Egypt. So I'm going to talk about them very quickly. Egypt, as you know, 15% of their population lives in coastal zones. And so most of the country, or a lot of the country, is vulnerable to sea level rise. The Nile River provides 97% of freshwater resources and is susceptible to changes in temperature, precipitation, and evapotranspiration, as well as the quality of the Nile is being impacted in terms of increased pollution, but also reduction of quantity linked to construction of the Ethiopian dam. So both of these result in pressures to mobility, climate-induced, as well as other factors in Egypt. And then climate change is expected, of course, to exacerbate these challenges in Egypt due to heat waves, desertification, and food security. And one thing to remember about Egypt is that their growth is still very much linked to greenhouse gas emissions, whereas Jordan is a smaller country and we have much smaller emissions, 0.06% globally. We're trying as much as possible to decouple our growth and adopt a green economic transition. On Jordan, my topic of better expertise, 1/3 of our population are refugees. 1 in 3 people you meet. Jordan has been hosting refugees for decades. At the same time, Jordan is known to be one of the most water-scarce countries in the world, and with high unemployment rates and low female labor force participation rates. Hosting of refugees, of course, places additional pressure on limited natural resources. Jordan is not an oil-producing country. However, we've made strides in adopting renewable energy. 27% of our electricity mix comes from renewables today. At the same time, infrastructure, including education and hospitals, are stretched due to this significant percentage of refugees. This is why Jordan last year launched the Climate Refugee Nexus Initiative at COP27, exactly to shed light on not just Jordan, but countries like Jordan. We've got Turkey, Poland, Costa Rica, other countries in the world that have a very significant refugee population, but at the same time suffer from climate change impacts. And so these countries many of them are considered not least developed. They could be developing countries, but they do require additional assistance and support to really handle the additional numbers of refugees that they're sharing their resources that are already very stretched. So in Amman, the spatial profile that was done under the UPIMC project showed that the key hazards are flash floods, soil erosion, and drought. I've witnessed many, unfortunately. In 2019, we had a very difficult flash flood event, and many businesses in the downtown of Amman lost their livelihoods. And so one positive development out of that actually is a project that UN Habitat implemented to introduce nature-based solutions in Amman as a way of capturing rainwater, A, because water is scarce, but B, as a flood management technique. So our hope is to try and expand the scale of this successful case study that UN Habitat has performed in Amman. And we'd love to see more of these nature-based solutions because they're low cost and effective. Finally, I'd like to mention a little bit about long-term planning. And I think these spatial analytics, what you said, Gia, before me, is that countries can use it to introduce infrastructure investments. So Jordan already has a Green City Action Plan with investments across 6 sectors, and some of them are linked to these climate resilience activities. So I feel like some cities in the region have kind of done their homework in developing their projects, their potential investments, but they need to maybe link to the right frameworks. And I think the framework we're talking about here today is an important one, and I think it's an untapped opportunity for countries of the region. I'll share a little bit about a mapping done by the EU also recently that looked at Jordan, Tunisia, and Morocco. And they look at the people's perceptions as one of the issues that also we need to provide additional attention to. When people do not realize that their migration or their mobility is impacted by climate, this raises their vulnerability. Also, an interesting finding was that women are more exposed, but at the same time more perceptive to the impact of climate change, but they have the highest mobility barriers. This is true in a country like Jordan, unfortunately, where public transportation continues to be an impediment to better mobility for women, for education, or for labor. And then finally, it's been found that people have an attachment towards their land, which plays a moderating role and reduces perhaps the rate of migration in some cases. Thank you very much for your time, and it was a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shada. I just want to ask Manuel Pereira to give us the closing remarks for the meeting. As head of the Division of Migration, Environment, Climate Change at IOM UN Migration.
Thank you. And to all present, the Minister, Ambassador, colleagues, I have a difficult task to summarize all of these, and I took a few notes on my phone. I hope to make justice to these points. A few highlights on all the complementarity things that were said here today. I would start with Sarah, noting that the willingness to stay of communities and the different knowledge levels that they have make this question very complex in many parts of the world. But also pointed that not all cities are growing, but the potential of migration is a reality that needs to be managed. The director has noted us that different voices are important to be brought to planning and to underline that urbanization is a key challenge of our current and future times, but united and with solidarity among actors, we can make the difference and a positive change. Noting also that it's important to understand the different dynamics that countries and regions have and the diversity of actors needed to find durable solutions. Our colleague Caroline has noted that planned relocation and climate have a challenging relationship. She noted 2 countries with policies when we know that there is more than 400 case studies of effective planned relocation cases, and more needs to be done to place people at the center of this problematic and as a long-term action. National adaptation plans and NDCs need to have mobility dimensions, and I would welcome here to note that IOM this year has completed a guidance for UNFCCC on how to mainstream human mobility in planning processes that will see the light as global guidance by the end of the year. It's also important, as our colleague from UNHABITAT pointed, that the umbrella programs that connect practice and theory are one of the ways to advance diverse and innovative solutions to these problematics. The examples given of the Sahel on urban migration and on dry land expansion show the diversity of challenging dynamics, but also effective solutions to these problems. And finally, our colleague that talked about MENA has highlighted how MENA region has challenges with water management and scarcity that are very evident. But she also noticed how climate fragility is emerging as a complementary risk due to the transboundary nature of water management that brings a new geopolitical challenge in many regions and with different climate impacts. All of these points together and the notions that are underlying to them, I would highlight inclusion, solidarity, partnerships, knowledge, and practice. With all of this, we can make communities safer, we can share prosperity, and we can advance the resolution of the impacts of climate change. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope that you can also connect to each other at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to thank our panelists, our audience, everyone here. Thank you, and looking forward to many other successful meetings. Thank you.